You've been taught that cutting off your mother makes you heartless, yet your hands shake every time you see her name flash on that screen. Most daughters believe they must choose between drinking poison daily to keep the peace, or burning the bridge completely and wearing the scarlet letter of ungrateful child. But on a random Tuesday, she discovered a third path that family therapists know but never speak. She stopped calling not from rage, but from radical love. This is the raw story of how 3 years of strategic silence healed wounds that 2 decades of forced birthday calls only deepened. Why her mother's anxiety actually plummeted when the contact ceased. And the single piercing question you must ask yourself before you pick up that next ring or finally reclaim your life. It was raining on that Tuesday. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but that gray, oppressive drizzle that makes the sky feel like wet wool pressing against your window. No thunder, just the steady whisper of water against glass that sounds like disappointment if you listen long enough. Her phone lit up at exactly 10:47 a.m. "Mom," the screen read. Therefore, her stomach dropped. But this wasn't anger. This was biology. Her hands didn't shake because she hated her. They didn't tremble because of some dramatic teenage rebellion that had calcified into adult resentment. They shook because her body had learned, through 2 decades of Pavlovian hell, that this particular ringtone meant danger. It meant the bracing. It meant the performance. It meant putting on the mask of a daughter who was grateful, small, and infinitely available to be corrected. You felt it too, haven't you? That split second before you answer a voice from your past, that metallic taste in your mouth, that sudden need to sit down even though you were standing perfectly fine, that inexplicable urge to apologize before you've even said hello. But most of us ignore that signal. We swallow the panic and pick up because we are good daughters, because we were taught that our discomfort is the tax we pay for being born, because somewhere in the manual of femininity we never agreed to read, it says that love means infinite tolerance. Therefore, we poison ourselves slowly, one Sunday call at a time, smiling through the toxicity until our teeth rot from the sugar we paste over the bitterness. Elena had done this for 23 years. Every Tuesday and every Sunday, like a religious observance that demanded her misery as tribute. She marked the calendar in her mind with dread, counting down the hours until she had to dial, her shoulders creeping up toward her ears as the clock struck 6. But the calls weren't always toxic. Therefore, the confusion cut deeper. Sometimes her mother would be lucid, warm, asking about Elena's garden or her new job with genuine curiosity that felt like sunlight after weeks of overcast. Therefore, Elena lived in a state of perpetual hope, swinging between the mother who bandaged her knees and the mother who weaponized her vulnerabilities. Maybe this Tuesday would be the good one. Maybe this Sunday, the love would outweigh the landmines, and they could finally just be two women talking instead of a daughter bracing for impact. But the pattern was insidious. Therefore, Elena had developed a ritual to survive the whiplash. She would answer with a smile, frozen so hard it hurt her teeth, place the phone on speaker, and mute the side button. Therefore, she could hear without being heard. Therefore, she could regulate her breathing in the left lung while her mother complained about the neighbor's dog in her right ear. She became a method actress playing the role of daughter who has it together, even as her nervous system screamed that she was under siege. But the muting stopped working. Her mother's voice, even filtered through polyester speakers, carried barbs designed by decades of practice to find the soft tissue between her ribs. "You've gained weight since I last saw you," the voice would say, casual as commenting on weather. Therefore, Elena would starve herself for 3 days, subsisting on black coffee and self-loathing, staring at her reflection, wondering when she had become so visible and yet so unseen. "Your sister never has these problems with her kids," the voice would add, sighing that particular sigh that suggested Elena was a defect in an otherwise perfect production line. "And did I tell you Sarah's wedding is going to be outdoors? In June? With all that humidity? You know how you get in the heat, red and blotchy, Maybe you should wear something with sleeves for the photos. For the bride's sake. Therefore, Elena would spend weeks comparing her insides to someone else's curated outside, wondering why her love felt so heavy when others made it look like effortless flight, wondering if she was the common denominator in her own misery. But here's what nobody tells you about chronic invalidation. It doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like jet lag that never lifts. It feels like being a phone battery that someone keeps unplugging at 90%. Therefore, Elena assumed she was simply weak, constitutionally unsuited for the normal friction of family life, fundamentally broken in ways that therapy hadn't fixed and yoga hadn't stretched out. Until the morning, she found herself on the bathroom floor at 6 a.m., dry heaving into the sink because her phone had buzzed with a simple "Good morning" text. The message was benign, just words. Therefore, her reaction made no sense to her logical mind. But a neurologist later explained what Elena couldn't understand. Nervous systems don't negotiate. Your biology doesn't distinguish between a tiger in the bush and a text message that precedes emotional entrapment. Therefore, her cortisol had been spiking every Tuesday and Sunday for 20 years, flooding her bloodstream with stress hormones designed for 5-minute survival sprints, not marathon filial duty. Her body was burning out because it thought she was living in a war zone. But you can't sue your mother for assault by cortisol. Therefore, Elena kept showing up, even as her hair thinned and her sleep fractured, and her boyfriend Marcus started keeping a calendar of her phone call migraines, watching her disappear into herself every weekend like clockwork. Until that rainy Tuesday when she simply didn't. She watched the screen pulse with light. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Therefore, the call went to voicemail. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was deafening. For the first time in 2 decades, Elena felt her shoulders drop away from her ears, felt her jaw unclench, felt the strange vertigo of realizing she had been holding her breath since puberty. She sat in that silence for 10 minutes, waiting for the guilt to kill her. But she didn't die. She just breathed. Therefore, she made a decision that would brand her a monster in family group chats and a cautionary tale at distant cousin weddings. She didn't block the number. She didn't send a manifesto declaring her emancipation or post a dramatic subtweet about generational trauma. She simply stopped answering. But the guilt came like a tsunami, delayed but devastating. Therefore, she braced herself for the extinction burst, the escalating calls that would come at 2 a.m., the flying monkeys dispatched by concerned relatives, armed with concern that functioned like handcuffs, the "Are you dead in a ditch?" messages that masqueraded as care, but operated as retrieval hooks. They came exactly as predicted. Her aunt called first, voice honeyed with concern that couldn't quite mask the accusation. "Your mother is worried sick. What kind of daughter disappears?" Therefore, Elena didn't answer. Her father texted that her mother hadn't eaten in 2 days, that she was crying herself to sleep, that the doctor was worried about her heart. She's your mother, Elena. You only get one. Therefore, Elena turned off the phone and sat in the dark, wondering if she had become the villain in a story where she had only ever tried to survive, wondering if her need for peace was actually just narcissism wearing a self-care mask. But something unexpected happened on day 47. The call stopped, not because of death or disaster, but because absence reveals clarity. Therefore, Elena's mother had to confront a question she had spent 20 years avoiding through the distraction of constant contact. What remains of a relationship when the daughter stops performing the role of emotional sponge? But here's the twist that family therapists whisper about in their closed rooms, the counterintuitive truth that sounds like heresy until you see it work. Sometimes the enmeshed parent needs the boundary more than the child. Therefore, when Elena stopped absorbing every projection, every anxiety, every unlived dream dumped into her lap like toxic waste, the mother had nowhere to put it. She couldn't pour her insecurity into a cup that was closed, so she had to hold it herself. Therefore, 6 months into the silence, Elena's mother called a therapist. Not because Elena asked her to, not because of some dramatic confrontation where truths were spoken and hugs were exchanged, but because the silence became a mirror she could no longer avoid by dialing her daughter. The silence forced her to look at the woman she had become when no one was performing for her validation. But this isn't a fairy tale where everyone rides off into the sunset, holding hands while violins swell and Instagram influencers post about healing journeys. The first Christmas was a special kind of hell. Elena sat in her apartment with the lights off, eating cold noodles straight from the pot, convinced she had committed an act of violence by simply protecting her nervous system from a seasonal obligation that had always ended in tears and slammed doors. The shoulds were deafening. She should be there. She should forgive. She should be bigger than this. Therefore, she questioned herself daily, hourly, in the small hours of the morning when the doubt gnaws loudest. Was she narcissistic for protecting her peace? Had she invented the childhood memories of being too sensitive, too dramatic, too much to handle? Did she owe her mother infinite tolerance simply because she had been born? But trauma isn't stored in your declarative memories like facts about state capitals. It's stored in your fascia, your gut, your startle response, the way your throat closes when you hear a certain pitch of voice. Therefore, when her hands stopped shaking every Tuesday at 10:47 a.m., when she could eat a full meal without nausea, when she made love to Marcus without the ghost of her mother's critique standing in the corner of the room like a cold draft, she had her somatic answer. The silence wasn't punishment, it was surgery. Therefore, the wound could finally drain, could scar, could heal into something that looked like wholeness. During those 3 years, her relationship with Marcus transformed. Therefore, he didn't have to spend Sunday afternoons walking on eggshells, measuring her mood against the length of a phone call. He got a partner who was present instead of bracing for the next psychological assault. But the sister didn't understand. Sarah called her selfish, accused her of abandoning their mother in her old age, of being cruel and unforgiving. Therefore, Elena had to explain that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks. "I'm not gone," she said. "I'm just no longer available for demolition. When she learns to knock without breaking down the frame, I'll answer." 3 years passed, but not the way exile usually works in family dramas, where the prodigal returns, and everyone pretends the clock rewound, and nothing ever happened. Elena didn't build a wall. She built a door with a lock that she controlled. Therefore, when she finally reached out, it was on her terms, in her timing, with her safety already secured and her nervous system regulated. She wrote a letter, not the kind your therapist suggests with bullet points about boundaries and I statements that feel like corporate HR policies, but a simple paragraph that said, "I'm ready to try again, but differently. I cannot go back to who I was. I hope you can meet who I am becoming. If not, I understand, but I won't shrink again." Therefore, they met for coffee at a neutral bookstore cafe, not at the mother's house where the ghosts of old arguments lived in the wallpaper, and the air itself felt judgmental. And her mother looked smaller, not diminished, but unburdened. Her eyes were clearer. She spoke slower, measured her words, asked questions instead of delivering diagnoses. Therefore, the conversation sounded different, because Elena wasn't there to be fixed anymore, wasn't auditioning for love that should have been unconditional, wasn't bracing for impact. She was there to be seen, or not seen, on her own terms. But the question remains, the one that kept you scrolling, that brought you here, that sits heavy in your chest right now like a stone you haven't coughed up yet. Therefore, here it is, stripped of the poetry and the therapeutic language and the softening metaphors. Every time you let that call ring through to voicemail, every time you silence a notification, every time you choose your own breath over their comfort, you are not being cruel. You are being honest. Therefore, the piercing question isn't whether you should cut them off forever or endure the poison until they die and leave you with an inheritance of complex PTSD. It's this: can you love someone enough to stop letting them hurt you? Because the lie we were sold, the one that keeps good daughters sick and shaking at 10:47 a.m., was that love means infinite tolerance, that boundaries are barbed wire when they're actually the fence that keeps the garden safe. Therefore, we became emotional landfills for family toxicity, accepting waste that would shut down any other relationship on earth, accepting the premise that blood grants unlimited credit for cruelty. But love without boundaries is just invasion, with a smile. Therefore, the next time your hands shake when that name appears, ask yourself not what they need from you to feel whole. Ask what you need from yourself to stay alive, because you are the child who survived. Therefore, you owe it to her, the girl you were, the woman you are, the future self waiting for you on the other side of this choice, to answer that call only when it brings you peace, or not at all.